Mr. James Mackintosh, formerly of the Financial Times, now currently with the Wall Street Journal. Welcome aboard to the Supply Side podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Thank you for making time for us as London gets underway for another day. We were just talking off air about a little bit about your backstory, and I made the point that economics is an inexact science. You made the point that it's not really a science. Take us back into that. Take us into a bit of your journey and what made you say that.
So I started economics. I did some economics at school, of course, but then I went to university and did a year of economics and ditched it because of basically because for me it was low grade maths. So I enjoy maths. I'm good at maths. I would actually have preferred to have done a maths degree, I think. But the economics took this false premise of the rational expectations and then built on it this huge edifice of stuff that isn't true, using some maths. And I realize now that once you get through the low grade modeling, you actually get to then the interesting stuff of discussing the premises and working out what actually goes on, and that at higher levels economics is very interesting. But I ditched it for psychology after my first year at university, I think that was probably more useful for studying markets than most economics is. Obviously, I've come back to economics since, and the interesting bits of economics, which are fascinating. But for me, most economics is really political economy. Not all of it. There are some bits that are more than that, but most economics is political economy.
So when you say the most interesting bits in your journey so far, which has been, quite extensive, what most interests you about this broad space of economics and political economy?
So I come at it from the point of view of markets, which I think are very interesting because, of course, you get expressed in markets is the combination of the money making desires of the investors, but also their expectations of what is happening in the economy and in many different aspects of the economy. So they obviously have different preferences to policymakers who don't particularly care about profits, but they have an awful lot of very interesting views, many of which are often horribly wrong, but which themselves are a large part of what happens in the economy, because of course it's all endogenous. The markets influence the policymakers and the policymakers influence the markets. So you get this unpredictability, which is fascinating, because you can't just make a simple model that works. History rhymes, but it doesn't perfectly repeat itself. You can't. No two events are identical, and you can never quite tell how investors will react or how policymakers and politicians will react, and all these things feed back into each other. And that's what makes an economy for me, and it's different to what you'll read in an economics textbook.
I want to ask you a couple of things. That's so interesting. I've recently been reading George Gilder's Knowledge and Power, and this information theory of capitalism, where you have these almost unquantifiable number of signals and inputs being sent between vast numbers of actors, and somehow, not exactly Smith's invisible hand, but somehow this stuff coordinates. And I remember being in New York with my kids a couple of years ago, and we were on Upper East Side and going into a supermarket there and seeing the vast amount of stuff, like even compared to Australia. I was just like, and then reading Gilder's theory, it's like somehow this supply chain, all of this stuff coordinates for all this stuff to be available. But what I wanted to ask you is on just what you were just talking about. Markets were no doubt never simple necessarily at any point in human history, but in this current historical sort of milieu, are we dealing with a level of complexity that's just truly epochal? Like, is it fundamentally different, the level of complexity we see now?
I think one has to think of the complexity and also think of the ability to manage the complexity. And always the complexity runs ahead of our ability to manage it. But at a time when Britain's supply of food, for example, arrived by steamship from Australia and South Africa and the Caribbean and all sorts of other places, the supply chains were intensely complex, and it's not clear to me that our ability to manage those supply chains was any, that the gap between the ability to manage and the complexity of the supply chains was any different then to now. Now, I don't know how exactly one would measure that. I don't think there's a sensible mathematical way of measuring that. Clearly, things are more complex now. Supply chains are more complex even than in the last big era of globalization before the First World War. But our ability to manage them is also way, way higher. I mean, back then, everything was pen and paper in giant, big, fat red ledgers. Nowadays it's all, much of it is done automatically. So clearly our ability to manage the complexity is also far higher. Now, I still think the complexity runs well ahead of our ability to manage it, as you see when crises happen, most recently Suez, but more generally, the failure to prepare, and we'll come on to this, I'm sure, but the failure to prepare inventories for the fast recovery in the economy, and so the shortages that we're seeing everywhere. The complexity is hitting, and we're seeing the complexity hit, and it's running ahead of our ability to manage it. But it's not running so much further ahead of our ability to manage it than when clipper ships failed to arrive in the middle of the 19th century. So I'm not totally convinced that it is the sheer complexity on its own that matters. I think that it's the gap between the two things that's what matters. And I don't think that's necessarily so much greater. And you see that in the crises. I mean, the amazing thing, and I was all prepared in March last year. My big worry in March last year was that the food supply chain was going to collapse. And amazingly, I could still buy everything. I could buy fresh beans flown in and pre-chopped in Kenya, and they were still available. It's like, how? I had no idea how this works. I don't know. I'm no expert on food supply chains, but everything continued to be available. The only shortage was Marmite, which did really bother me. But other than that, everything was fine.
I think most of the planet probably survived the absence of Marmite. My gosh, do you remember Bovril? Did you ever have Bovril as a kid in the UK?
That's the sort of the beef version.
Yeah,
Of that, I'm afraid.
yeah. I think they served that in Guantanamo Bay twice a day. Just on that complexity question, I would assume that there's now many more actors in markets than may have been the case once in history. I don't know if that changes the complexity, but I mean the change in financial instruments, right? I mean the derivatives. I mean, is that relatively new? Is that adding another layer, or do you think markets have always had that level of complexity?
So my favorite example of derivatives in history. Now, there have been derivatives ever since there have been markets, pretty much. I mean, not formally. I think the first ones were Japanese rice futures or something. But don't hold me to that. This is from a vague memory of reading some financial history a long time ago. But my favorite example of derivatives in markets is the British lottery bonds. So the British government used to finance itself with bonds that paid a coupon only depending on the outcome of a draw. So they'd draw a number and announce that bonds with this number would pay a coupon this month. And obviously the coupon was higher. And that was a fabulous financing method because, like all lotteries, people overpay for the chance of winning. There's your overlap of psychology and markets instantly. But the investors and London's investors at that point, you'd think this is the 17th, 18th centuries, were pretty basic, really. I mean, the stock exchange was still sort of just getting going, and yet at that point they had derivatives and insurance policies on these lottery numbers, so you could buy an insurance policy against your number not coming up, and you could buy derivatives on, they banned them fairly quickly, but you could buy derivatives linked to the numbers with an active options market going. There were strips, the whole thing was there. Everything that we look at now was there. No, they didn't have Bitcoin futures, Dogecoin futures. That's getting a bit far, but nonetheless, the speed with which these derivatives markets were set up back then was not very different to today.
Wow.
So the basic building blocks, I think, of markets you would recognize at least for a couple of hundred years as being fairly similar. Now, the speed of them, of course, was much slower. You didn't have nanosecond trades. You didn't even have 1 second trade. And, leverage was implied leverage, one of the great trades of the time, right up till I think the 80s in Britain, was that you had either bi-weekly or monthly settlement. So you obviously had free borrow for a month.
Yeah, my gosh.
You buy it with nothing down, and you don't have to pay for a month. So there were things like that were available that aren't available now. But yeah,
it was funny as you say that. As I was preparing to come in the studio, I was looking on the shelf here and can't see where it is, but there was one of the first books I read maybe 10 years ago was about some of the big traders building their own fiber optic networks across the entire continental USA. And I was like, when I was reading it, I was looking around thinking of people thinking I'm going to be some kind of crazy conspiracy theorist, but it was like extraordinary to realize that those, nanosecond trades were becoming a reality. And just on that, I mean, I want to get onto your recent articles, but how are algos changing this? Like, I've heard numbers as high as sort of 80% of trades are now algorithm based. So surely the algorithm trading has got to be a historical sort of a big historical change.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is that we don't really know. There are large numbers of people who will immediately, whenever anything bad happens, see it was the algos. And it is quite clear that sometimes, some things very bad can happen because of badly designed algorithms. We've seen various times when that's been explicitly identified that someone had put in their trading plan into an algorithm and got it wrong, and it's had an influence on the market. And of course, 1987 is not exactly algorithms, but new financial products gone wrong massively accentuated the crash. If you're a traditional market maker who used to sit there answering the phone and taking both sides of trades for people, you're not quite out of business, but out of business broadly. There's not a lot left for you because the algorithms have replaced the market makers. There are lots of people out there on the plus side who are not algorithmic traders, but who think that it's great because it's made markets much more efficient. The spreads have narrowed, the trading is easier, liquidity is better. But just like any other form of market making, when things are bad, you can't get a trade. So the algos turn off in just the same way as in 1987. If you were trying to sell as the market crashed, you couldn't get a market maker on the phone. And that is how it works. Of course, no one wants to be the market maker who bought in the middle of a crash and lost their bank's shirt for them.
I think I had it when I started to really study this stuff. I had a good look at the algos, and I remember talking to my wife, and I said, I'm good at a lot of things, but when I look at the equity markets and algorithmic trading, I just don't back myself to feel confident in that space at this particular moment in history. Hence my sort of, love for other forms of investment. But it's interesting listening to you. I watched an interview with Kirill Sokolov and Druckenmiller the other day, and Sokolov's kind of going, so do you run any algorithmic trading at the family office? And he's kind of like, maybe, sort of alluding to the fact that it's even for the ones that even for the Buffetts and the Druckenmillers, they're definitely got toes in the water on that kind of stuff, understandably. So I want to talk about some of your recent writing. I came across this through Christopher DeMuth at the Hudson Institute. You're writing on inflation. You've been writing a great deal in the last in recent time, and I also read your stuff on Bitcoin today. And I like the part about the ability to lose wallet addresses and that sort of stuff. My wife and I had an interesting journey a few weeks back where I bought a bunch of Litecoin and managed, because I use a cold storage wallets, and I managed to send my Litecoin to a Bitcoin wallet by accident, and
Okay.
then spent 4 weeks with a whole bunch of experts slowly trying to get this back. And sitting up at night realizing, how do I break this, to Karen? Is it like, hey, do you like surprises? Do you like, so eventually we got it back. So it took a lot of work. But when I read your stuff today, I said, yep, that is a reality. That this I don't know what, in your article, I think it was what percentage of Bitcoin is
There
missing?
are estimates. I mean, there are estimates out there, and I've no way of I haven't done any work to try and assess these estimates, but from people who spend their lives analyzing this stuff, reckon that as much as 20% of Bitcoin has been.
Yeah.
But of course, there's no way to be sure, because a lot of this stuff is, there's been no moves in the wallets, for 5 years. But it could be that it's just someone sitting on it. The ultimate hodler.
Yeah.
But a lot of it, but they, at the very least, a lot has been lost. And of course, if you think about it theoretically, in the long run, when they hit the 21 million cap, eventually it'll all be lost.
Yeah.
So one be someone who owns the last remaining Bitcoin, because all the rest is lost and no one has the keys for it. I love that idea. Anyway.
It's Peter Schiff talks about whales, right? The idea that there's 5 to 10 mega owners of Bitcoin, and because I think I mentioned to you, I did the crypto economics program at Oxford, and you write about this well, and it's not the focus of our discussion today, but the blockchain technology behind Bitcoin's already been superseded by much more effective, cryptos. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. And I think also I cannot see how central banks let it win. I just can't see how that happens, because if it does, the whole idea of nation states and sovereign governments implodes, right?
Yes, I mean, I can't see how it wins in that sense, because unless you believe that nation states will stop taxing, then you're going to continue to have other currencies. Now, at the moment, there's a small advantage for certain things, that it is genuinely hard to do certain types of instant transactions, particularly in dollars, because the dollar settlement system is atrocious. So if you're a retail customer, I'm not sure how the Australian system is, but in the UK retail bank customer, if I want to pay another person in the UK, I can do it instantly and the money's there straight away. So in the UK, there is no advantage to using crypto for personal payments. It's also free, because the banks sort of soak up the cost. So, there's really no sort of payment system advantage there. For certain cross-border transactions where it can be very expensive, you can just about make a case for crypto. And for certain speed transactions in countries with very backward settlement systems like the US, you can just about make a case for crypto. But most of the time, most crypto payments are more expensive and slower than using fiat currencies. And there's a good reason for that, right? Which is that the blockchain's a distributed database, and a distributed database is always going to be slower than a centralized database. So there are things that the fiat system needs to fix, and the US is now working very rapidly on a rapid payment system for domestic payments in the US, which I think will fix some of the problems. But mostly, almost no crypto is used for actual payments, except for things that are illegal. There's a good reason to use it for things that are illegal. And within the illegal bucket, I would include, transferring money through capital controls in Venezuela or in China, or wherever, to get money out. But broadly speaking, it's not used as money. It's used, I think, the way that you're implying with your lost Litecoin, which is it's an investment, right? You plan one day to sell it again.
It's a hedge, yeah.
But in order for that to happen, you've got to find a sucker willing to pay more for it, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
You know,
This is the Peter Schiff mantra. It's like the tulip thing. It's just you've just got to find one more person stupider than you. That's all you
yeah.
need. It's funny listening to you because I bought something in the US. I bought a beautiful penknife that I as an anniversary present for myself, and a friend of mine, it was 20-year wedding anniversary present. And Karen's like, "What do you want?" I said, "Leave it to me. I'll take care of it." But I bought this beautiful penknife, and I couldn't get it into the country. Eventually, a friend of mine in Washington bought it for me and sent it over, and I'm just trying to pay her back. I'm trying to put money in her account. I don't use PayPal because I don't like their privacy stuff. And I'm like, it's still really hard to actually just send money to someone. It's surprising how, for such a technocratic culture, that we still struggle to make our payment rails a bit more lubricated.
Yeah, it's the cross-border stuff that's the problem because of
Yeah.
bank-to-bank settlement, and also because banks charge fees where they can, right? And
Yeah.
one of the places they can charge the fees and do charge the fees is on international transfers.
Yeah.
If you shop around, I mean, certainly in countries that have a lot of international transfers, like the US and the UK, there are very cheap ways of doing it.
Yeah.
As private sector things have stepped in to fix it. And there are some that are remarkably cheap. But broadly speaking, sending a small payment to someone is hard and expensive.
Yeah.
But sending a small payment via Bitcoin is also hard and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
expensive. So,
I've started Googling carrier pigeon, long distance carrier pigeon.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about this great article on May 5th, because I know people listening going, Jonathan, stop talking about your anniversary present and talk about James's articles. You wrote a brilliant article on May the 5th with the very unambiguous title, Everything Screams Inflation. And you've got 5 great points in this. I mean, I want to work through those with you. But I want to take you to the opening statement, which was great. The opening sentence, unambiguous. We could be at a generational turning point for finance. Then you continue, politics, economics, international relations, demography, and labor are all shifting to supporting inflation. So that's your opening statement. And you sort of say the last 40 years of monetary and fiscal policy have been trying to suppress inflation. Tell us what you see as the big fundamental shifts.
Well, so, I mean, the first one, the biggest thing which is behind all of it is this shift in thinking about political economy that I see, which I think feeds into quite a few of those factors, not all of them, but quite a few of those factors. And that is that after 2009, there was a broad global consensus that what we needed was austerity. Governments were far too indebted and we had to do something about it. What we've seen this time is that there's a not quite perfect, but a pretty broad consensus across an awful lot of places that what we need is to spend more money in order to solve a variety of problems that you can tick off, but primarily among which are issues around different things in different countries, but in the US, inequality. In the UK, they call it levelling up, kind of regional inequality. In Europe, they're worried about falling behind on all sorts of things that they feel that the government needs to spend more money on. Now, one might express some skepticism that they're going to catch up with the US on tech by having the French government spend money on tech, but you never know, right? And so you've got this shift that more government spending is now politically acceptable in a way that it wasn't. So that's the sort of big shift behind it.
What do you think's at the what do you think's at the very basis of that? Because I mean, it'd be easy to say it's kind of some sort of cultural Marxism, but what do you think is at the core of that impulse? I
think that the failure of last time. I think that people saw the outcome of the austerity in 2010 onwards didn't work. So I think there's a broad feeling against that that's been harnessed by some. Well, it's pushed politicians on left and right towards more spending, more debt. Combined with that is incredibly low interest rates. I mean, the failure of So the second aspect of the political change is the approach to monetary policy, which is that there's a new theory out there, which is MMT. I say new, it's not really new, but it's not really a theory, but nonetheless, it's seeped into political culture. Now, most people, the vast bulk of people, are not full-blown MMTers, but there is a deep truth in MMT about how money works. And whilst I disagree with them on their conclusion, I think they're right about how money works. And the result of it is that pretty much now everyone accepts that the US is not turning into Venezuela. That the US government can spend whatever it wants and it doesn't make any difference. And they've got evidence of that. They've also got evidence that QE does not cause runaway inflation because, you think back to 2010 and the letters to the Wall Street Journal by prominent economists, fund managers at the time, warning of the danger of runaway inflation because of QE. The Fed doubled down. It did QE2, it did QE infinity. It's still doing QE. And, where's the inflation, right? I mean, okay, now we are starting to see some inflation, but that's not exactly because of QE, should we say. And so, there's a whole bunch of changes in mindset that go with that, which is that, well, anyone who says, well, we can't do this because we can't afford it, is going to find that argument hard to press.
So my brain is exploding as you're speaking. I'm thinking of George Washington's. I think it was Washington. I said this in the last interview that the founding fathers had this idea that no generation should incur debts that it cannot pay off in its own lifetime. So when I listen to you, and you've got some background in psychology, is it simply that profligate spending, dare I say the word, is easier to sell in political economy than austerity? Like I listen to you and I think in your own household, you don't, for extensive periods of time, spend more than you make. So how does it not work at the micro level of human households, but it can work at the macro level of nations and governments? I mean, how do we resolve that?
Well, nations aren't like national finances are not like household finances. So there's a big difference there.
Because you can't print at home, right?
No, not that so much, but you can't have, so all the parts of an economy have to balance. So a nation can't, as a whole, save in aggregate, except in as much as another nation in aggregate spends.
Yeah.
In the same way as if every household were net savers and no one was a borrower, you remember the flip side of your savings is someone else's borrowing. So if everyone is a saver and no one is a borrower, you've got a real problem. And what happens is interest rates fall in that scenario, right? So what you need to encourage someone to be a borrower. It doesn't make, the old maxim of neither a borrower nor a lender be, is fine, right? If no one's a lender and no one has any savings and no one's a borrower, that's absolutely fine. That can work, right? But you're kind of in the Stone Age if you're in that scenario. You've got to have a financial system has to have lenders and borrowers, and at a nation state level, they all have to balance out. And that's one of the sort of core maxims that that's behind MMT. But if companies, if you think of the economy divided up into its parts, I mean, just take it as two parts. They're very simplest: the private sector and the public sector. If the private sector are net savers, the public sector has to be net borrowers, otherwise it doesn't balance. Now you've obviously you can bring in foreigners as well into that. But overall for the world as a whole, it has to balance. So, it doesn't make sense just to say, well, governments shouldn't borrow or something like that. And there are clearly limits to borrowing, but no one knows where they are. And at the moment, at least, the cost of borrowing, so the interest cost that governments are spending for developed economies at the moment, is lower than it was. So they're spending less to service this debt.
Yeah.
Right. It's costing you as a taxpayer less Australia obviously has very low debt to GDP, but in the US now, with debt to GDP at 100%, it's cheaper to finance that than it was when they had debt to GDP at 80%. So, there's a issue that as a household, if you were to apply a household analogy, and I really don't think one should, but if you did, you'd say, well, hang on, interest rates have fallen, I can afford to borrow more. You could apply that, and some governments are explicitly doing that. So the UK government has now accepted that as an argument. Now, I think they're wrong. I don't think that should make any difference. I think that they need to look at it as parts of the economy balancing. But nonetheless, that is their argument. And politically, it's a very easy argument to make because of the household parallel. If money's free, why wouldn't you borrow, right?
I've got plenty of friends doing just that right now. You've got 5 great points here. We'll spin through them really quickly, and then we might just unpack them a little bit. Number 1, central banks less concerned about inflation in general. We've now obviously got the average targets rather than the direct targets. Second point was the shift to massive deficits, and you've spoken to that a little bit about the lessons of austerity being resisted. Globalization out of fashion. Now, when I read that, is the impact on that of inflation, is that to do with tariffs? Is that with globalization, economy shifting to a more domestic focus, that it's tariff and trade barriers that are going to drive inflation?
No, it's more, I mean, in the short run, that does happen, of course, but that tends to be deflationary, just as taxes are, because, I mean, tariffs are taxes, right? But in the long term, it means less competition. Okay. So in the same way as if you think back to the the olden days, what was it? Is it Holden? Was the
General Motors Holden?
Much regretted loss of a brand, but
moment of silence.
But if you go back far enough, there was a point where that was pretty much all you could get. Now you can buy 20 different makes of car, right? And you take that obviously is more competition, so that just keeps prices down. So the maker of the Nissan can't just jack up its prices by $1,000 a car, because Toyota will sell more cars if they do that. So, but if Nissan's the only brand available, of course they can jack up their prices by $1,000 a car. So the more you have tariffs, the less competition you have, because it's harder for more of those companies will pull out, and that applies all the way down the supply chain. And it's not really that I expect actually many of the car brands to pull out. It's more that throughout the supply chain you get these blockages which push up prices all the way through. So you're seeing it already with the sort of pull out of China that lots of companies are doing because of the politics. So it's not purely tariffs here, it's a whole bunch of things.
Okay. Number 4, which is something I've been fascinated with for at least a decade, around demographics. You make the point that China has peaked, let alone the imbalance. I think it's for every 100,000 females, there's 130,000 males born. So they've got, my understanding is that China's not only got demographic problems, it's got a lot of social cohesion problems in terms of the differences in gender birth rates, plus relative poverty gaps between coastal regions and the interior. And then you also said that US is at its lowest population growth since the 1930s. So tell us what your take is on the global demographic implications for inflation.
So in a sense, it's similar to the supply chain issues. So if you just think of it as that, perhaps the major contributor to long-running inflation is wage inflation. And if I come along and there's 100 workers and I add another 10 workers, what do you think that does to wage inflation? Well, all else equal, that means less inflation, right? There's more supply and the same demand. Now, obviously, all else is not equal. But when China came along in 1980, 1979 onwards, and then later joined the WTO in 2000, that added a huge pool of new workers. That's a massive disinflationary impulse to the whole world, and it wasn't balanced by China consuming a lot more. Now, obviously, China consumption has gone up. I mean, in Australia, you know all about this, right? You ship almost everywhere. Till the trade battles recently, you ship virtually everything, right? But the balance in China is that they have a huge export surplus. So the impact on the world is hugely disinflationary of adding this massive pool of relatively well-educated, relatively cheap workers. And that coincided with a political pressure on labor unions around the world. So trade unions were under huge pressure. They've not quite disappeared, but collapsed almost everywhere. And obviously, again, that means less ability to push for wage rises and more competition, because you're competing with everyone else you work with, right, for a pay rise, rather than all getting together and saying to the company, we want a pay rise. So globalization is a large, it is part of this. Demographics is part of this. Politics is part of this. That again, Biden is now pushing in the US for more unionization. Unions in lots of places think they've got a chance to come back here. They're pushing again. There's pressure on if you think about the most extreme end of this, it's the gig economy, where you're literally competing online for the work against everyone else in the gig economy, right? And if you've ever done this, you can log into one of these sites, register for it, log into one of these sites and try and get work. And you are literally competing with people. I mean, depending on what the work is, obviously as a delivery driver is not competing with someone in India, but for the online software stuff, you can be competing with someone sitting in Mumbai, and saying, well, can I get this work? Well, what's the price? Well, the global price for that work is going to be set by the person who's willing to do it for the least money, as long as they're high quality. So all of that feeds together into competition, and demographics just naturally takes some of that away, removes that pressure. So again, we had this big disinflationary impulse, and that's now switching towards being an inflationary impulse. Demographics doesn't change overnight. But nonetheless, that's the direction of travel is shifting.
So let me ask you on the demographics. So unfunded forward commitments for the US government in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, pensions, I've heard figures up to 130 trillion or something mind-boggling. Similar here in Australia, and you and I both have young children, and that can keep us awake at night. So how does that play out in 20, 30 years time when you have a shrinking labor force globally and vast forward commitments? I mean, how does that play out?
Well, there's lots of ways it can play out, but for one model, look at the UK. So the UK had these vast pension commitments, just defaulted on them. So you used to be able to retire at 60 as a woman in Britain, and now you can retire at 67 as a woman in Britain. So now, because the government doesn't have a contract, it just has a promise, you pay the same. In fact, you pay more for your pension, but you get to retire 7 years later. And I don't think one can't be absolutely sure. It could be solved by much higher taxes, of course. But I think in the US, it's much more likely to be solved by various forms of default. That could be quite messy, particularly if you look at how these things are applied. So Medicare, Medicaid, they're relatively easy. They're promises. So they're written into law, but they're easy to change. They're not contractually liable here. But state pensions are a real problem. City pensions are a real problem. Started to see some of that already. You've had the occasional bankruptcy where they're reorganized. But a lot of this stuff will have to be fixed by bankruptcy and reorganization, or by national action. And I think certainly for the states, it's much more likely to be fixed by national action, some federal law that annuls them or divides them up in some way. But I think a lot of the people who think they've got a pension worth, really quite a lot in many cases, will find that it isn't. And politically, that's going to be difficult, should we say, which is why, of course, they keep putting the problem off, because no politician ever wants to deal with it.
And on that, do you think there's an inherent flaw in our current political economy where, political terms are 4 to 8 years here in Australia, and, I remember Peter Schiff has that great quote where he says, "You don't go into politics to make money; you go into politics to make money, after politics." So, is it too cynical to say that a significant percentage of our political elite are making decisions that they literally won't be around for the implications of them? Is that too cynical?
I mean, you know, it's hard to know how many, right? I think
Mm.
a very large number of politicians clearly go into it because they want to do something.
Mm.
They don't start. They've been. They started at school with their interest in politics. They didn't start there because they wanted to make money, or they would have been investment bankers, right?
Yeah.
This was not their primary motivation for most of these people. Not all of them. Some of them are clearly very highly motivated by the money.
Yeah.
But I think for a large number of the politicians, and certainly a large number of the politicians I've met, they didn't go into it primarily to make money.
Mm.
And in fact, I think you'd be foolish to go into it primarily to make money,
Mm.
because you can make far more money far more easily at a much younger age by becoming an investment banker and retiring at 40. Right? If that's really what your motivation was, you would have done that. You wouldn't go into politics. That's not the same as saying they haven't got any motivation to make money. And clearly, there's a strong tendency to feather their own nests. If you look at, even mild things like the parliamentary pension scheme, or the Senate healthcare scheme, or whatever, they don't punish themselves, shall we say?
No.
Um, but yes, I don't think that's primarily the problem. And I mean, on top of that, you go back to the hackneyed old Churchill quote of, democracy is the worst political system there is after all the other ones. What else are you going to do is the problem. I mean, you're going to give people 30-year terms. I mean, you could do, but I'm pretty confident that wouldn't lead to better government. You might get, the best form of government clearly is benign dictatorship. But the problem is that no one's ever managed to have a benign dictatorship that stayed benign. And that's why we have democracy, for all its faults. So it may be that that's an explanation, but I don't think it's a solvable problem, what you're bringing up. And we can fix bits of it around the edges. You put pressure on politicians who do take money-making gigs on the side or afterwards. They're generally frowned on. They're kind of limited. We can ban things, restrict things, and obviously I would say it's a lot better now than it was. So there's a lot of high-profile politicians former politicians who've made a lot of money. In Britain, just look at Tony Blair, right? But you can also look back and say, well, hang on, they used to take straightforward bribes while in office. No one batted an eyelid. That was how business was done, right? Go back to the South Sea Company, and half the House of Commons was on the board. And this is kind of normal. Stuff is a lot better than it was. The US, go back to the glory days of American kind of Wild West capitalism in the late 19th century, and every major stock market player had senators in their pocket. This was how it was done. And so you got to be you kind of, I think you're right that one can criticize the system, but I think you also have to have improvements. And I think there's still plenty of scope for improvements, but I don't really think a benign dictatorship is the answer.
So look, brilliant. I think you've captured that. You've expressed that really, really well. As I said to you, having coming into this whole space quite late in life, the polemics are extraordinary. As you'd know, there's there's plenty of YouTube channels and podcasts where everybody rants about the Fed. But it occurs to me, it's like, well, if you were in their position, what would you be doing differently? Like, I think you make a great point. We have to. I think it would be good to have some valid solutions before we criticize too much. But the other thing's interesting too, is I've said this in recent interviews, is there was a long form interview with Jordan Peterson and a guy, Professor Tuny, Tuny, who's with an organization called, I think, humanprogress.org, and they've got over 2,000 data sets on the website of the improvement in the world in general, like everything from sanitation to infant mortality to, people moving out of absolute poverty. So I find it kind of fascinating that as much as the world's in this, is that what it is?
Yeah, factfulness.
Is that
Hans
what it is?
Rosling.
There you go. Yeah.
So, I mean, the subtitle on this is 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff is a lot better than it was, right?
Yeah. Or, for we've been, Homo sapiens for 350 plus thousand years, and we only got flushing toilets in the last kind of, 100 or so. So there's definitely a lot to be appreciative for. So other stuff here in the article, when you're talking about central banks, you made an interesting point that one of the other levers that the Fed's trying to pull is soaking up excess labor. So, but then you also made the point that if they tighten policy, that it's often going to be a lot of the marginal sort of aspects of the labor force. So people who are in very low paid jobs are the first to go. It made me think about this question of how many tools does the Fed really have left? So we'll get on to your other stuff in a second, but if inflation starts to really move, and we've seen that change in the last week, what are the levers left?
Do you mean what can the Fed do to stop inflation?
Yeah. What
I think it's very easy. I mean, it's very easy if the Fed wants to stop inflation and just jack up interest rates. I mean, they know they can do this, right? And that's one of the things, of course, that gives them some confidence here. So I didn't mention it earlier, but part of the issue for central banks is they spent 10 years being wrong about inflation. So they spent 10 years expecting inflation to pick up, and it really didn't. It didn't. They constantly undershot their forecasts. And as a result of which, they're now saying, well, we've got to let it run. We've got to, instead of forecasting that inflation will go up and acting on that basis, we've got to wait for the inflation because we're constantly wrong in our forecasts. We always expect more inflation than there is. So we've got to let that inflation appear before we do anything, because apart from anything else, the central banks know they can deal with high inflation. They've dealt with that many times before. They know how to stop high inflation. It hurts the economy, but they can do it. But they don't really know how to stop low inflation. And they all kind of look askance at Japan and say, God, we don't want to be there, right? And they know that if they get stuck in if the population has a mindset of low inflation or negative or deflation, that they can get stuck there and there's just nothing they can do. It's a trap, and they don't want to be there. And as a result of which, they're desperate to get inflation up, and they have been proven wrong for so long that mindset's now changed, and they've said we'll wait, and maybe it's better to just let it overshoot a bit. And then the politics of it then comes in. I know the central banks are supposed to be independent, but they're well, first of all, they're just a lot less independent than they were, because they've been working hand in glove with government because of hitting the lower bound, and the tools that they've been using require them to work with the government. But also they have always been highly sensitive to politics. It's part of what they do. What they do is too important. And it's there, it is the reason I mentioned the minorities, it's the Fed in particular. The Fed has been talking a lot about how running the economy hot helps the, as you put it, marginalized workers, but specifically they're talking about minorities in the States. And getting those people into jobs is obviously an important thing to do. But my view is that having been public about that and emphasized it, and emphasized that that's one of the reasons to run the economy hard, if you then say, well, we've got to slow the economy now, when you start raising rates, those are the people that get hit first. That's politically quite difficult, because you're saying, well, we're going to throw out of work 100,000 black people. That's not a good political message to be sending, even if you're saying, well, we've run the economy hot, so we've helped 500,000 black people into jobs. If that was, I mean, they're not as explicit as that, and of course they wouldn't say that, but nonetheless, if that's kind of what's going on and everyone knows that's what's going on, I think that adds an extra barrier to raising rates above what they normally have.
So help
Normally
me.
they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's nothing to do with us. We're focused on inflation, and what happens in the jobs market is a sort of a consequence, not our primary goal. And now it's their primary goal.
So the Federal Reserve Act changed in relatively recent history, didn't it, to include maximisation of labour participation, right?
Yeah, full employment.
Yeah. Full employment.
Which they don't define as everyone having a job, of course.
Okay. So help me with my simplistic understanding that if the Fed was to tighten policy and interest rates shifted north, I mean, we have bubbles everywhere, right? Like, how does that not pop these bubbles, like in equity markets, in real estate, like here in Australia? Like, having lived through COVID, like as I said to you before, it wiped our business out completely. The global fundamentals just seem, everything seems quite unusual. How does a tightening of monetary policy not burst those bubbles?
Well, a tightening of monetary policy clearly hurts some things. The question is, does it suddenly snap? Does it break things, or does it smoothly suppress them? So, take Australia. Do house prices go down by, a fixed amount for every 25 basis point rise in rates, and house prices, I'm making this up, but say house prices went down 1% for every 25 basis point rise in rates, then the RBA can keep raising rates at 25 basis points and know exactly what's going to happen. On the other hand, much more likely is that the market somewhere has a tipping point, and that you raise rates to 2% and nothing much happens. You raise rates to 3% and the market falls 30%, and that is much more likely, in my view. Not that nothing much happens at 2%. You probably do get some suppression of house prices, but it's much more likely that you have these tipping points because people can no longer make their mortgage payments and have to sell, become forced sellers, and the forced sellers lead to sudden drops in markets in a way that you don't get in traditional models. So traditional economic models don't have tipping points. They have nice smooth relationships. And what you're saying is, well, we're in bubbles in lots of places, and therefore the tipping point is closer, and that's possible. That's certainly possible. I wouldn't say that is something anyone can confidently predict. We just don't know, right? We don't know where that tipping point is. So the last time, if you go back to the Fed raising rates up until 2018, the Fed did start to push rates up, right, under Janet Yellen, and it didn't get very far. And one thing that happened was that people started to anticipate a recession at the end of 2018, and the market fell very, very sharply. Now, there's no way. Causal links are hard to prove, right, in markets. Whether that was the Fed, or whether that was that the market was overdone, or whether it was that people looked at each other and saw other people selling and so sold, or or deeper shifts in the economy that made people suddenly start to worry about it, irrespective of what the Fed was doing. But all these things feed back into each other, and you ended up with a very sharp fall in markets. But then when the Jay Powell came out at the start of 2019 and said, actually, maybe not, the markets all recovered. So, I think there are these tipping points, and they are at some point related to the Fed and to central banks in general. I just don't know where they are, and I don't think anyone really knows where they are. And that's the problem we have, and that's the problem that the Fed has as well, of course, because if the market falls 20%, it's very hard, or 30%, it's very hard for them to continue raising rates because of the feedback into the broader economy of the market having fallen so much.
So let me ask you, Could you see the reestablishment of a gold standard?
No,
Because
it doesn't make any sense. I think it's completely incompatible with with a proper democracy. So if you have to, as a population, believe that what should vary when there's a recession is employment, not the currency. So what you have now is when there's a recession, the government pays lots of, government spends more. Some of that's automatic stabilizers like unemployment benefit and so forth. And the central bank cuts interest rates. And as a result of which, there is obviously a rise in unemployment and so on. But usually also the currency falls. If it's a pure domestic recession, not a global recession. What you want your currency to fall so that you ease some of the pain on your workers. That's the idea, rather than unemployment. You could say, well, we're going to maintain the currency and force lots of people out of work. That's what happened in Britain after the First World War under Churchill. He decided to re-establish the gold standard at the old level, which frankly was too strong a currency. So Britain had too strong a currency and had, whilst the US started the Roaring '20s, Britain had a very major depression, extreme, much more than a recession, really deep depression, which set the scene for a pretty terrible decade. So I can't see that really being compatible with the beliefs of most people nowadays, and with democracy. So you really have to believe that above all else, what matters is a hard currency in order to have a gold standard or an anything standard, in order to say that the value of money is more important than the value of jobs. And I just don't think that populations will wear that.
That's such an interesting insight. People all over the world wake up in the middle of the night thinking about things, but it's going to have me awake at 2 a.m. now. I'm just because today I sold out all my final equity positions today and bought more physical metals, and I'm fascinated by that insight, and I wish I'd spoken to you yesterday.
Well, I mean, but you wouldn't buy gold because you expect a gold standard. I mean, because a gold standard isn't necessarily good for the price of gold.
Sure.
I mean, it might be, but the gold, currently it could be established at any level, right? I mean, governments can choose what they decide to tie themselves to. So you've got to be a bit careful about that, especially when you think that the big stocks of gold sit in central banks.
All right. I hope you're happy and keep me awake tonight. Now, here we go. A couple more things because I want to be respectful of your time. Your article on May 18th, inflation's magic number is 4. You made interesting points. S&P's established in 1957. Interest rates have gone above 4% 9 times, and 8 of those times stocks were lower 3 months later. Can you just take us through that? Just take us through your thinking around that magic 4%.
Yeah, I mean, so I would be, whilst I think 4% is the number, it's not like that it's 4.000 that matters.
Sure.
It's somewhere around that. And it's that the mindset of investors switches. So if you're close to deflation and you're a shareholder, you're worried, right? Deflation is very, very bad for share prices.
Yeah.
You don't want to be in that. So as inflation starts to rise above 0, that's good for shares. You like that. When it starts to get above 2, it becomes less good. You're no longer thinking, oh well, the deflation fears are lower because, frankly, you've already forgotten about deflation once inflation got above 2. It's not that big a deal. But you're still thinking, well, it's all right. We don't need radical central bank action. We don't need anything major. I don't have to worry about runaway inflation. Things are okay around this level, 2-3%, no problem. Once things start to get out of control, we know that very high inflation is not good for share prices. Certain sorts of shares are okay, value stocks and cyclical. But for the market as a whole, it's generally not good. We know that the other thing that happens, obviously, with high inflation, central banks tend to step in, and that hurts. That can often cause a recession. And that's one of the things that you start to worry about. It's certainly bad for share prices on its own, higher interest rates. So if you have inflation, if you're worried that inflation is starting to get really high, or may start to get really high, that's a reason not to hold stocks. And of course, above 4%, you're starting to worry about that. So that's broadly speaking, a change in mindset. And it just so happens that 4% has been the number. Now, is that always and everywhere bound to be true? I would say probably not. It could be 4.5%, it could be 5%, right? It could be 6% in some countries. In China, or in developing countries, or in developed economies a long time ago, in principle, if you were a place that had higher inflation and had accepted higher inflation, it would be a bit above that before you started to really run away, right? If you had stable inflation of 4% for 30 years, you obviously wouldn't be worried about 4%. Maybe it would be 6% there, or 8%. But it so happens that in the US, 4% has been the number, and there's a sort of good argument for why, because it's about this change in mindset, which I think is now well underway, that investors are absolutely very highly sensitive to what happens to inflation in a way that they just weren't. If you go back 9 months, people were welcoming higher inflation, and now they're not.
It takes us back to where we started, the interplay of psychology and political economy and so many other factors. It's gloriously inexact.
Yes, exactly.
So the last couple of things you mentioned, the fear of the Fed losing credibility, leading to volatile bond yields. Can you speak to that? The general level of confidence in the Fed's credibility in general at the moment?
Yeah, I think people are worrying about that. I don't think the Fed has lost credibility. I think at the moment the markets are priced that in the long run the Fed will have inflation absolutely under control at its target, or thereabouts. It hasn't lost credibility, but people are much more worried about the outlook than they were, because quite clearly a whole bunch of things are happening that mean it could go wrong on inflation. And one of the interesting things is that people are very uncertain in both directions. So the Fed we might have a big overshoot, we might have a big undershoot again, because some of the deep forces, I laid out, we just discussed some of the things I think are long-term big forces pushing towards inflation. But of course, we still don't know. Maybe the Fed will counteract all of those with much higher rates. Maybe some of the deflationary forces that we've just seen at work, very large debt outstanding, lots of zombie companies that could go bust if rates are raised, or when government support is removed after COVID. There's all sorts of things that could come through that might mean we are in economically deep trouble again. And if we are in economically deep trouble again, of course, that's going to be bad for inflation. Inflation goes down again. So these investors are highly uncertain, and in some ways that's a problem, because of course the Fed wants them to be certain, wants them to be sure that inflation is going to be 2%. That's the whole point. That's why it has this target. It's why all central banks have these targets. What you want is low and stable inflation, and you want people to believe in low and stable inflation, because in part that belief in low and stable inflation helps to ensure there is low and stable inflation. So
I listened to you, and I have this image of my must have been the 80s. I was a young kid, and I have this image of growing up in Queensland, and my mother one day and I think rates had got to something like about 18-19% in Australia for mortgages. I can still remember the look on her face in that. I'm going, Yeah. So I just hope, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't want to go back there.
I don't think. I mean, I'm not. You know, everything screams inflation doesn't mean we're going back to the 70s.
Sure.
Certainly, I mean, who knows, right? 20 years, I wouldn't make a 20-year forecast here. But this is, don't take away from this that the 1970s are just around the corner, because they're not. There was a very different environment then, on a whole bunch of things.
Mm.
But the pressures are much more in that direction than they have been for 40 years.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's
good.
the that's
Yeah.
the thing that I think is interesting. Um, so
So let me ask you, we'll wrap up. We're not giving financial advice to anybody on this show, but what do you think people should be thinking about? We got a pretty diverse listenership. We've got some real economists and a whole bunch of other sorts of people. Um, I've minimized exposure to equities now. I've hedged into metals and reducing debt. What are some of the things people should be thinking about if your broad thesis is in the ballpark?
so I think that it's a very difficult position for investors at the moment, because we've got I would distinguish between the long-term inflationary pressures, which play out over kind of 3-5 years, and the short-term inflationary pressures playing out right now.
Mm.
That in between there might well be a lull, right? The Fed might be right that what's going on at the moment is a specific combination of supply side problems. There's bottlenecks everywhere you look, right?
Mm.
Which are pushing up prices. But those won't last forever. There's no reason to think that shortages of microchips are going to last forever, right?
Mm.
This is a very specific problem. Shortages of lumber in the US. These things are going to be fixed. Maybe they'll be fixed early next year. Maybe they'll be fixed in 3 months. I don't know the answer to that. It'll vary by bottleneck. The shortage of shipping containers, all these things that are going on, these things are going to be fixed, and they're a result of COVID, not a result of a broader, deeper shift in the global economy. So
Mm.
once those bottlenecks are fixed, all those supply pressures go away again. The demand side, obviously, everyone is flush with cash from huge global government subsidies, and Americans in particular are flush with cash. And again, that's led to a huge demand shock at the very same time as we've got these supply bottlenecks. And
Yeah.
that leads to short-term inflationary pressures.
Mm.
But the government is not going to do another round of handouts. Stimulus checks aren't arriving in the post anymore. Um, the only thing, obviously, if we have another major crisis, maybe they will, but they're not doing another round of handouts with the economy where it is. So what we should expect is that demand side pressure comes down, and that supply side pressure eases. And maybe the Fed is right then that the inflation goes away, this short-term inflation. But all those long-term pressures are still there. The
Yeah.
problem is, of course, for investors, is to try and trade that long-term thing without getting caught up in the short-term thing. So you could say things like, "Well, I want to buy copper or gold or whatever," but all of those prices are elevated because of the short-term problems, and I want to trade. I run a major risk that all those short-term problems might go away before the long-term inflation kicks in.
Mm.
And it might not. The two things might dovetail, right? We might get that all this high inflation that we're seeing at the moment carries on for longer, that the demand carries on for longer, that the supply side shocks carry on for longer. It's hard to tell. Some of the supply side stuff might prove permanent. Shortages of copper, for example, are very hard to resolve. It takes a long time to build a new mine, these sorts of things. But that creates a problem for investors. So I'm afraid that there is no simple solution here. That hedging inflation is relatively expensive.
Mm.
As always, you wanted to do this 9 months ago.
Yeah. It's like when was the best time to buy real estate? 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
When's the next best time? Tomorrow. So are you you've got kids. Are you an optimist or a pessimist or an omnivist as you look into their future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the sort of person that thinks, well, I probably ought to be prepared for a zombie apocalypse just in case.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think I'm pretty optimistic about them.
Yeah.
Which is not the same thing as being optimistic about the global economy, but I think probably will. I mean, I suppose I have to believe that we'll muddle through, because otherwise I'd be, holed up in a bunker somewhere. But all the major warnings of everyone who has been holed up in a bunker somewhere throughout my life have always proven wrong. There's always been reasons to panic about stuff, and it's never quite been right. So, lots of bad stuff has happened, and the economy will. I mean, I think the British economy, for example, is not particularly great place, and I live in Britain. And obviously, I've just lost a whole bunch of sort of freedom of movement stuff that takes away. If there's a zombie apocalypse in Britain now, I can't flee to Spain or France so easily. But I exaggerate for effect there. But for my kids, they'll live in whatever world there is, and all I can do is prepare them the best I can. And I think holding up in a bunker with them probably isn't the best preparation.
Yeah, my brother's one of my older brothers is an historian, and he told me about I'm sorry I don't have the exact details, but might have been around the 15th or 16th century, possibly in Germany. There was a group of people who were convinced that that God was going to flood the earth again, and so they built a whole series of ships on the Danube, waiting for their version of the zombie apocalypse that didn't arrive. So I take your point. Sometimes you can prepare as much for the apocalypse that doesn't come. So
one way to think about that as an investor is, what's the cost of your insurance? So you want to insure your portfolio against inflation. If that inflation doesn't arrive, what was your insurance premium?
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of thinking about structuring the portfolio when you're thinking about how much do I want in cash, how much in bonds, how much in stocks, how much in gold or commodities. What if that thing I'm worried about doesn't happen? And historically, how often has that thing I'm worried about not happened?
Yeah.
And what will it cost me if it doesn't? And I think that's a sort of insurance mindset on structuring a portfolio. I think it's a good thing to at least think about. When doing it. And I probably wouldn't go 100% in anything, because nothing is certain. I would always have something in different asset classes.
Yeah. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed that. That's I just think you're such an interesting thinker, and I will put links everywhere to your work on in the Wall Street Journal. So I really encourage people listening to make sure that you get across to the journal, take out a subscription as I have, and make sure you're getting James's stuff, because I genuinely, I mean, I can even prove it. I even have extensive notes from his recent articles here. So my friend, I want to thank you for your work. I think you write really well. You write clearly. There's a humility in what you're writing, which I really enjoyed. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for joining us today. And I feel we could go for a lot longer, but I'd like to stay married and make sure I'm home at a reasonable time. So James Mackintosh from the Wall Street Journal, thank you so much for making time for us on the Supply Side podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan.